it's a great puzzle how cultures lose their way. I mean, in the 20th century, we have the example of National Socialism in Germany. In the course of this weekend, we've talked about how Vedic India was based on the total celebration of some kind of psychedelic, and that it was lost, 100% lost, so that, there are a few pundits in India who claim they know what Soma is, but nobody can produce something which performs as advertised. Greater than Indra, greater than Brahma, shaper of the world, Soma. It's pouring forth from the Soma presses, gushing forth to intoxicate the multitudes. Well, what kind of drug is this that you can have 3 daily pressings and intoxicate hundreds of people, and it has no reputation for anything except the highest state of ecstasy, and this goes on for 1,500 years, and then bingo, nobody knows what it is, nobody makes it, nobody can find it. It's just something talked about in old books. How do cultures lose their way? It's a hard thing for us to understand with our electronic obsession with, preserving everything, digging in colonial outhouses and cataloging the pottery shards and all this. We're savers of the past, but many times, several times in Chinese history, there have been enormous book burnings to basically dial back the cultural clock to 0 and start it ticking again. The burning of the Alexandrian Library was an event like that in the West. I mean, there were over 1 million volumes in the Alexandrian Library, and the guy who burned it said that there are 2 kinds of books here. Those who contradict the Quran, they are heretical, and those that supplant the Quran, and they are superfluous. Let it all burn together. And that was the second burning of the Alexandrian Library. It was also burned by a Christian barbarian enthusiast called Alaric the Visigoth, the same clown who burned Eleusis behind.
I just have 2 brief questions. The first one, I just wanted to know more about the visual puns of the machine-like elves, or elf-like machines. The second question is, I know of someone who recently went to Holland and they brought back some tryptophan, and I've read something in the literature about combining an MAO inhibitor with tryptophan, and I just wanted to know if you knew anything about the effects of that or anything like that.
Well, I think tryptophan is an MAO inhibitor. I'm not sure. Tryptophan is a common amino acid. If they're thinking of starting toward DMT, I think you can start from tryptophan, but I think it's easier to go from indole. As far as self-transforming elf machine puns, what exactly did you want to know about them?
Just if you could kind of elaborate on the 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, 5, what, maybe give an example of, I know it's kind of hard to put into words, but.
Yeah, well, it's some kind of transformation of category, where things are made out of things which are impossible. I mean, as I said, how can something be made out of yesterday, consomme, and hope? It's impossible to conceive of something like that. And so, in the presence of these puns, they break down ordinary reality even more than it's broken down anyway in the DMT state. It's like, it's not enough that you're loaded on this psychedelic mega hallucinogen. Now they tell you crazy jokes, which you get in that state. It's sort of like the surrealists used this, saw the pun as a way of opening the crack between the worlds. And it would be a great challenge to artists to do this. I mean, the surrealist I'm thinking of who certainly leaned on this was René Magritte, where, foreground and background trade shape, and outlines of things are silhouettes of other things, and this sort of thing. Maybe it's a uniquely human capacity. And we can argue about whether animals think or not, but I don't think anybody would give you much of an argument that they pun. There's very little evidence of that.
Terence, what about psychotherapy?
Well, I think anything which gets people free associating and talking freely and making previously hidden connections in their biographical material, in doing that in the presence of a skilled therapist, if the therapist then practices their craft with skill, it's hard to see how that isn't going to synergize the therapeutic process.
Is there a venue for that in this country?
You mean, are there people doing it?
Yes.
Well, it's very underground because giving people these things without an IND is illegal, and here you're dealing with people who are already self-defined as needing psychotherapy. But some of you may know that book, The Secret Chief, about a psychotherapist. To this day, those of us who know him don't use his real name in public. In the book, he's called Jacob. But Jacob was a guy who so strongly believed in psychedelics. He was a superb therapist to begin with, fully credentialed. And he taught hundreds of people how to do psychedelic therapy. And someday that story will be told, because I think that was the heart and soul of transpersonal psychology in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The joke on psychotherapy is whether you're Jungian, Reichian, Kleinian, whatever you are, 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. Well, I don't really think that's true of psychedelic therapy. And the psychedelic therapy, it's arguable, or it's a complex issue, whether it should be used in cases where people are severely disturbed. The people who seem to profit most from psychedelics taken in the presence of psychotherapists are people I would describe as the worried well. People who are anxious or have hit a block in their career or have a relationship coming apart, but these things happen to people. And, I know psychotherapists who I really believe probably 95% of every psychotherapeutic session they have with somebody changes a life for decades, if not forever. It's one of the great tragedies, and we've taught McCarthyism has been bared, and the blacklists in Hollywood, we've all done our mea culpas for that, and the Rosenbergs and so forth and so on. But we've never, as a society, dealt with the way science and human mental health care was sacrificed on the altar of government paranoia in the 60s in the name of repressing psychedelic drugs. I mean, there was work going on at Saskatoon in Canada with Humphrey Osmond and in other places. They were curing serious lifelong alcoholism with a single dose of 500 gamma of LSD in the presence of a psychotherapist. They were having incredible results, treating addiction, serious trauma, all of this stuff. Well, then that just went down the tubes. And the psychotherapeutic community didn't have the political muscle or the guts or something to resist that. The scientific community, which is very quick to tell government and everybody else to take their hands off. They can do anything they want with studying human sexuality. They can do anything they want with animal experiments. They can do anything they want. Well, they just totally folded on this drug thing. And, my brother is a professional drug designer, molecular chemist, and his career, this whole story of his career is how unwelcome and threatened people felt by having good psychochemists in their presence. If you're going into medical pharmacology, stay away from psychedelics if you want to have any career at all. The number of people who've been able to overcome those barriers and make significant careers and do research and publish, you can count on the finger of one hand.
Is that true for the international community as well?
It's not as bad, but it's still, most of the world just doesn't deal with it. I mean, Germany, there's some people, chemists, other people interested, so some Swiss people. It's sort of traditional there, I mean, try and name a psychedelic drug that wasn't invented within 700 miles of Berlin. It can't be done. But, the Japanese make no contribution, the English make no contribution, the French make no contribution. It's just not looked at. Bizarre, because the impact, if you're a psychotherapist or a neurophysiologist or anybody else, the impact of giving somebody 200 micrograms of LSD, which is a vanishingly small amount of physical material, is just stunning, but it's not been pursued. Yeah. Ibogaine is interesting. Ibogaine is a psychoactive alkaloid that occurs in a plant, Tabernanthe iboga, that occurs in Western Africa, in the armpit of Africa, in Gabon and Zaire, and it's used traditionally, although we have no record of it being used by anybody before 1850, which is kind of peculiar, because it looks like an ancient usage, like people have been at this for thousands of years. But the Portuguese have been in there since the 1430s, and there's no mention of ibogaine before 1850. It's a bush. You scrape the bark, you eat it, you hallucinate. The alkaloid is unique and psychoactive on its own. The reason research is being done in this country and it's being somewhat talked about is because the claim is made that it interrupts heroin and cocaine addiction dramatically. I wouldn't rush to sign up for that. I mean, it may. I think all psychedelics have this ability. It's not that ibogaine is a magic bullet for heroin addiction. It's that if you take a strong psychedelic and you're an alcoholic or a junkie or an abuser or fucked up in some way, it's going to be very hard to go through that trip without confronting this. And then you just say, I'm killing myself, or I'm making the people around me unhappy and killing myself. And it's hard, once you actually say these words to yourself, not to form what good Catholics call a purpose of amendment, to try and do better. People say, well, this question of are we better people? I think it's possible to be a bad person and take psychedelics, but it's rare because it requires enormous powers of denial and ego. Most psychedelic people are pretty mellow because they're used to looking at the shadow and confronting the various facets of themselves and other people. It's a tolerant, gentle crowd, generally speaking.
If you look at the records, we have millions of people even in this country who claim to have some kind of encounter. And studies of most of them that have been done have shown that they tend to be very what we would call normal people. A lot of them have had no previous interest in this field at all, housewives, accountants, and so forth. So from that point of view, and many of them have also been scientists or people who are credentialed in some way. So to dismiss them as, people who have had some kind of bias in that area, I think we'd have to delve into that a little bit more, as I'm sure you've thought about. Also, I just read an article that was pretty incredible where I think a former Air Force officer came forth and said that he had been responsible for planting technology from a crashed saucer in major corporations, in this country, and that was eventually reverse engineered, and a lot of people feel are responsible for the increased technology since World War II, including computer chip and a lot of other things that have come about recently and certainly revolutionized where we are right now. So I just, wanted to ask you again if...
Did you hear me right, is what you're wondering?
Yeah, right. I know your previous writings have been somewhat more liberal in that regard.
First of all, let me say, I saw a flying saucer. I saw it up close. I wrote about this in True Hallucination. But there is... Are you suggesting, you said millions of people believe they've been abducted. Are you suggesting that that you believe that millions of people have been abducted?
I didn't say abducted. I said had some encounter with, like yourself possibly.
Oh, well, by some encounter, if what we mean is that some people have felt the cosmic giggle come near, I don't think you can get through life without that happening. The problem I have is, first of all, this is hard to talk about, but maybe worth talking about. First of all, because of my position as whatever I am, I get to meet all these people off stage, so to speak. And it's not been a confidence-building experience. Also, I noticed you had a tendency in your question to lead with credentials. An Air Force colonel, a Navy officer, a ex-NASA scientist. I mean, when I hear the phrase ex-NASA scientist, I reach for my revolver. This is I think what we have to, first of all, nice people do not understand how mendacious, scheming, lying, and bizarre, pathological people are. They can't imagine it. That's essentially what being a nice person means, is evil is a mystery to you. I think that a lot of people are making a lot of money spreading anxiety. Anxiety is cells. And the earth change people, one by one, we tick past the Edgar Cayce prophecies that don't come true. One by one, now every piece of physical evidence from the first 30 years of the UFO phenomenon has now been shown to be fake. None of those photographs stand up under modern computerological deconstruction. And so my method, because I'm interested in the weird, the miraculous, the bizarre, the unearthly, the other. But my method has been to go to the place or the person or the thing and then not believe. Ask hard questions. And everybody else goes and believes. Well, the truth doesn't require your belief to exist. But hokum does. Hokum requires a relationship between the consumer of the hokum. And I've argued with Bud Hopkins, I've had lunch with Whitley Strieber, I've argued vociferously with John Mack, and these people are second-class thinkers. You would not send them to investigate a bus accident. I'm sorry that this is true. I didn't know this. I assumed, as most people do, that the word expert has meaning. It has no meaning. It's just a piece, it's public relations flackery. You're a UFO expert if you say you're a UFO expert. And when you go into so my method has been, as I said, to kick the tires and make it real. The other thing is, and people don't like this, but to examine the messenger. Is the messenger, you mentioned in your question, these people are normal, run-of-the-mill type people, accountants, lawyers, so forth and so on. In fact, when you look at these populations closely, they're weird. For example, the abduction population. A paper was written showing that the abduction population tends to cluster in middle-aged white women of the middle class who stay home. Well, what is that population, folks? That's the population of people who watch more daytime TV than any of the rest of us. If our average TV consumption is 5.5 hours a day, this population is pulling up the slack for those of us who don't watch and is watching 15 hours a day. And this is an area where, you see the newspapers being vended at the grocery store. Virgin Mom 9 gives birth to alien Christ. Are we all clear that this is a joke? All of us, including the remedial readers and the people who just got off the boat from Somalia last week, and everybody, are we all looking at it through the eyes of a Harvard intellectual with a BA in English literature? I'm not sure. So this is what I call the balkanization of epistemology. And part of it has to do with us all apparently this was left out of our curriculum recently, what's called rules of evidence. If you're a lawyer, you learn what are called the rules of evidence. What do a given set of facts actually mean? And in this UFO game, people, first of all, they repeat things. Never with citation. They say, did you see that article the other night or that thing on Channel 6 a few weeks ago about this thing that happened in Argentina where and it's never accompanied by citation. So it's a multi-networked game of telephone where these rumors move out and are endlessly adumbrated and changed around. And all for the purpose of filling in people's blank spaces. And I don't like see, I think there are two phenomena. I'm not saying there aren't strange lights in the sky, that we may not know what they are and that they could be anything. But that's subject A. Subject B is the UFO community as a social phenomena. It's a paranoid community. These myths that are being propagated are always myths of disempowerment. It's that they came to Babylon and gave us an alphabet because we couldn't think it up ourselves. It's that they're giving us fiber optic technology and computer chips because we couldn't think it up ourselves. It's always about poor humanity receiving the largesse of the Space Brothers, and all we have to do is trade them human fetal tissue and some other stuff and they'll be happy. It's a backward fantasy that the media has drummed up into a hysteria. And if you really care about it, if it really speaks to you, then you must go and investigate it. You cannot understand it by consuming it from the media. Because all these people that you hear about, Jacques Vallée and Bud Hopkins and John Mack, the gods of this, do you think they would stand out if they were sitting here in this room? Do you think if we had them in front of us that these would be towering geniuses or men of deeper insight than you and I? Get real. It's just the New Age book circuit. It's just marketing and people making careers. Not that they're insincere, but that they're limited, as you and I are limited by our understanding and our past history. I was invited a few years ago to speak at a big UFO conclave in LA, and I had never been to one. And I thought, as I'll bet most of you think, who have a moderate interest in this, that if you go to one of these things, what you will find is a whole bunch of sincere people who have had strange experiences and who are trying to figure it out together. That is not what you find. What you find is booths, the Urantia book, Commander Rama, the Raelians, Billy Meyer, the Palladians, the Roswell incident. And these people operate side by side, having coffee, holding smokers for each other, and so forth and so on, with no sense of cognitive dissonance whatsoever. It doesn't ever strike them that if the Raelians are right, then how can Commander Rama be right? And if he's right, how can Billy Meyer and this doesn't come up as an issue. And you realize these people are having a lot of fun. But they are not, this is a support group for some kind of fallout from a religious hysteria. This is not about the study of strange lights seen in the sky at night. And if you try to talk about that, people will just look at you like, who let you in? It's now all about channelings and prophecies and the rise of Atlantis and the beam from the center of the galactic whoop-de-doo and the photon belt and the coming of Melchizedek if Maitreya will get out of the way, and on and on and on. And I find the only defense against this is the conjuring rod of irony and reason. If it seems absurd, it probably is absurd. Now, I'm not saying that the world isn't strange. I'm actually saying that the world is stranger than these cheerful UFO enthusiasts can even begin to imagine. The stars are so diffuse in space and time, the evolutionary time spans available to life so vast, that the idea that the alien intelligence will, communicate through sparkling-eyed, blue-eyed, middle-aged women with bold haircuts and moo-moos is mind-boggling to me. And so it's just a matter of, how do you tell? And I have this argument with Ralph all the time, and Rupert, because they're both softer than I am. And I'm getting more hard-boiled in my old age because I see how a lot of people take all this stuff much too seriously and can't even really think straight. I read an interesting essay a few months ago in a book about all this by Douglas Stillings, and he said, when you encounter somebody with a strange belief, the question we have been asking the wrong question. The question we've been asking is, why do you believe this? Wrong question. The question we should be asking is, why do you believe that you believe this? Because the interesting thing is, these people don't act differently than you and me. Somebody can claim they were an abductee and they did this and they did that. They don't act the way I would act if I were abducted. If I were abducted, I would come apart at the seams. Do you realize the implications of being abducted by an alien spacecraft? I don't think I would be satisfied to just tell my story to John Mack and become case number 232 and then sit back and let him handle the public relations fallout of it. These people do not behave as though their story was true. They behave as though it's a story. And so somehow what we're dealing with here is clashes of epistemic values. The Carlos Castaneda phenomenon was a good example. Half the people who want to talk about Castaneda want to talk about, is it true or not, or was this guy some kind of a charlatan? The other half says, what kind of a question is that? You don't even understand the issue. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Well, without taking sides on that issue, notice that these two groups don't have much to negotiate, because for them the very notion of truth has taken on a different meaning. One is saying the truth of myth is truth, and the other is saying the truth of myth is a bullshit concept. We want to know if this is the truth or not. Yeah.